Hello guys, my name is Victor Bloodstone. Today I will be telling you guys about 5 true, original and disturbing stories happened in cemetery. So let's get started. Story 1. The Whispering Graves. Cemeteries, with their somber beauty, had always fascinated me. As an amateur photographer, I found solace in capturing the melancholic charm of these resting places. Little did I know that one particular visit would lead to an experience that would forever haunt my memories. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to explore an old cemetery that I had heard was rich in history. The gravestones stood like sentinels, each one telling a silent story of lives long gone. As I roamed through the rows, my camera in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the landscape. It was then that I noticed a peculiar detail: a cluster of graves that seemed untouched by time. The headstones were weathered, but the dates of death were recent, all within the past decade. Compelled by curiosity, I focused my lens on this seemingly neglected part of the cemetery. As I reviewed the photos later, I noticed something chilling: a faint, ghostly figures hovering near the graves, faces etched with sorrow, staring directly at the camera. Undeterred, I returned to the cemetery the following evening. The air was heavy with an otherworldly energy as I approached the cluster of graves. A soft, sorrowful murmur filled the air, like the echo of distant weeping. I set up my camera, hoping to capture more evidence of the spectral figures. As I snapped photos, the whispering intensified. It was as if the very ground beneath me held a weight of untold stories. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and I felt an icy breath on the back of my neck. The whispering turned to desperate pleas, and the figures materialized before me, faces twisted in anguish, eyes pleading for acknowledgement. Terrified, I fled the cemetery, my camera clutched tightly in my hands. The photos revealed not only the apparitions but also the names on the gravestone as of victims of a forgotten tragedy, their souls trapped in a cycle of grief. To this day, I can hear the whispers in my dreams, a haunting reminder that some stories refuse to be buried. Story 2. The Fandom Mourner. It was a gloomy afternoon when I decided to explore a historic cemetery known for its ornate tombstones and eerie ambience. As I strolled through the weathered paths, a peculiar sight caught my attention: a woman in a black veil, standing beside a particularly weather-beaten grave. The woman's presence struck me as odd. Dressed in an outdated, mourning gown, she seemed out of place in the modern world. I approached cautiously, my curiosity overcoming the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice almost drowned by the eerie silence of the cemetery. She turned toward me, her face obscured by the shadow of the veil. Without uttering a word, she pointed to the grave: a nameless, forgotten soul lost to time. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery, extinguishing the candles and rustling the leaves. The atmosphere became charged with an otherworldly energy. The woman, still silent, pointed toward the horizon, her gaze fixed on a vanishing point that only she could see. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a soft glow enveloped the grave. The woman began to wail, her mournful cries echoing through the cemetery. It was a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, a lament for a life unlived and a death unacknowledged. Unable to comprehend the spectral encounter, I watched in stunned silence as the woman dissolved into the gathering darkness. The air felt heavy, laden with the echoes of grief. Days later, haunted by the experience, I researched the cemetery's history. I stumbled upon a forgotten tale of a woman who had lost her lover to war, her grief so profound that it bound her spirit to the cemetery. Legend had it that she appeared to those who could sense the pain of unspoken tragedies. The phantom mourner became a recurring presence in the cemetery, her silent vigil a reminder that some sorrows endure beyond the veil of death. Story 3. The Vanishing Tombstone. On a moonlit night, I found myself in a cemetery rumored to harbor a mysterious energy. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of adventure, I ventured into the labyrinth of graves, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath my feet. As I explored, I came across an old section of the cemetery, its gravestones weathered and cracked. One tombstone, in particular, drew my attention: an ornate marker adorned with intricate carvings. Its inscription hinted at a tragic demise, the details lost to time. Intrigued, I decided to capture the tombstone's details with my camera. But as I focused my lens, the air seemed to thicken, and a strange unease settled over me. I took the photo, only to discover that the tombstone had vanished from the frame, leaving an empty patch of grass. Confused, I examined the spot where the tombstone had stood. To my shock, the ground felt different, as if I had stepped into an area untouched by time. I shone my flashlight around, and the beam revealed a hidden pathway that led deeper into the cemetery. Driven by a mix of curiosity and trepidation, I followed the unearthed trail. The air grew colder, and the moon's glow filtered through the twisted branches of ancient trees. The pathway eventually led me to a forgotten section of the cemetery, obscured by overgrown vegetation. There, in the heart of the neglected area, stood the missing tombstone. It emanated an eerie, ethereal light, and the carvings seemed to come alive in the moonlight. As I approached, the temperature dropped, and I felt a spectral presence. Whispers echoed through the stillness, revealing the tragic tale of the soul buried beneath the vanished tombstone. The spirit spoke of betrayal and a premature death, a story that had been erased from the visible records of the cemetery. Overwhelmed by the encounter, I realized that the tombstone's disappearance had been a call from the other side, a plea to unearth the hidden stories of the forgotten. As I left the cemetery that night, the vanished tombstone remained visible, a beacon of remembrance for a soul long ignored by the passage of time. Story 4: The Weeping Willow and the Haunted Graves. The cemetery was a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was beneath the branches of an ancient weeping willow that I witnessed a series of disturbing events that defied explanation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the graves, I noticed a spectral figure seated on a dilapidated bench beneath the weeping willow. The figure was dressed in mourning attire, their face obscured by the veil. Intrigued, I approached the bench. The figure seemed oblivious to my presence, their attention fixed on the graves beneath the willow. Soft weeping emanated from the shadows of the veil, a mournful sound that seemed to blend with the rustling of the leaves. "Who are you mourning?" I asked tentatively. The figure turned toward me, their eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Without uttering a word, they pointed to a cluster of graves beneath the weeping willow. The names on the tombstones were faded, their inscriptions barely legible. As I watched, the air around the graves shimmered, and the ghostly figures of a family emerged. Their faces were contorted with grief, and their voices echoed through the silent cemetery. The family spoke of a tragedy of fire that had claimed their lives in the 19th century, leaving their souls trapped in a perpetual state of mourning. Unable to comprehend the spectral encounter, I retreated from the weeping willow, leaving the mourning figures to their eternal lament. The atmosphere remained charged with an otherworldly energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the weeping willow held a connection to the trapped spirits. In the following days, I delved into the cemetery's archives, uncovering a forgotten tale of a family that had perished in a fire beneath the weeping willow. The tragedy had left an indelible mark on the land, and the family's restless spirits continued to grieve beneath the branches of the ancient tree. Haunted by the encounter, I returned to the cemetery with the fringe, a gesture of acknowledgement for the spirits trapped in a cycle of sorrow. As I placed flowers beneath the weeping willow, a soft breeze stirred, and I sensed a fleeting gratitude from the ethereal figures. The cemetery, once a realm of silence, became a place of shared mourning, where the living and the dead coexisted beneath the weeping willow's ancient branches. The haunting lament had found a witness, and the spirits, though trapped, seemed to find solace in the acknowledgement of their forgotten tragedy. Story 5: The Graveyard Shift. Cemeteries held a peculiar allure for me, not just as final resting places but as silent repositories of history. It was this fascination that led me to accept a job as a caretaker for a historic graveyard, a decision that would soon plunge me into an otherworldly experience that defied rational explanation. The cemetery was nestled on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by ancient oaks and crumbling stone walls. My responsibilities were straightforward: attending to the grounds during the day, ensuring that the tombstones were in good repair, and locking the gates before nightfall. On my first night shift, the air was thick with an eerie quietude as the sun dipped below the horizon. The tombstones cast long shadows, and the rustle of leaves in the night breeze seemed to whisper forgotten tales. I patrolled the grounds with a flashlight in hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. As the clock struck midnight, an unsettling chill settled over the cemetery. The air seemed to thicken, and the atmosphere grew heavy with an otherworldly presence. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the natural spookiness of the graveyard at night. But then, I heard a soft, melodic hum that seemed to drift through the tombstones. I followed the sound to a weathered mausoleum, its iron gates creaking in the wind. The hum emanated from within, and curiosity overcame any trepidation I felt. As I cautiously pushed the gates open, the humming ceased, and the mausoleum fell into a hushed stillness. The interior was dimly lit by a faint, ethereal glow, revealing rows of dusty coffins and forgotten relics. In the center of the room stood a figure, a woman in a tattered Victorian gown, her eyes fixed on an ornate, aged casket. The woman turned toward me, her face pale and translucent. A cold wind swept through the mausoleum, and her voice, though soft, echoed through the silence. "He's waiting for me," she whispered. I stood frozen, my senses battling between reason and an inexplicable force that seemed to pull me toward the mysterious woman. She pointed to the casket, a coffin that bore the name of a man who had died more than a century ago. "He promised he'd return for me," she continued, her voice a haunting lament. "Every night, I wait for him, and every night, he calls me closer." As she spoke, the atmosphere became charged with a spectral energy. The glow around her intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The woman reached out her hand, and for a moment, I felt a cold, ghostly touch. I recoiled, my mind struggling to grasp the reality of the encounter. The woman's gaze remained fixed on the casket, and with a mournful sigh, she faded into the shadows. The ethereal glow diminished, leaving the mausoleum in darkness. Terrified yet compelled to understand, I researched the history of the cemetery. The tale that unfolded was one of tragic love and a promise that transcended death. The woman, Amelia, had lost her lover in a distant war, and before his departure, he had vowed to return for her. As the years passed, Amelia's spirit had lingered in the graveyard, awaiting the fulfillment of the promise. The casket in the mausoleum held the remains of her long-lost love, and every night, she believed he would come for her. Haunted by the encounter, I continued my caretaking duties in the cemetery, knowing that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than I had ever imagined. The graveyard shift became a nightly communion with the spirits, a reminder that some promises, even in death, refuse to be forgotten. If you liked the stories, then consider liking the video and subscribing my channel, as it would motivate me to make more videos for you guys, and thank you for watching this video.